Welcome to the Unreal BootCamp lesson on creating user entities. In this lesson, we'll be using user entities to store the user's progress in the example game's Horde mode. The first thing that we need to do is to determine if the user has already created a user entity to store the data. To do that, we'll use the getEntities_by_type request. For this request, we need to supply the entity type as the parameter. In the event that the request returns an empty entities array, that means that the user does not have a user entity for the supplied entity type parameter. In that case, we'll then use the createEntity request to create the user entity programmatically in the example game. This request takes in the following parameters: the entity type, the initial data, and the entity's ACL. Click the JSON response to familiarize yourself with the data that the request will return. Open the Unreal editor. We are going to need to create a C++ class. In the C++ class's Space Shooter folder, right-click and select New C++ class. This class will not have a parent class. Click Next. Name the class User Data. Create the class. Now that the user data class is created, open Xcode and navigate to the userdata.h file. To start, delete the generated constructor and destructor. Then declare two public overloaded constructors, one that takes in the entity ID, the entity type, and JSON data. The other constructor takes in just the entity ID and the entity type. Then declare a public copy constructor and a public default constructor. Declare a public method called setLevelComplete. Then implement a trio of public getters, one for the entity ID, one for the entity type, and one for the formatted JSON data. Then declare four public Boolean getter methods, one for each level in our user entity data. Declare two private fstring member variables, one for the entity ID and one for the entity type. Then declare four private Boolean member variables, again one for each level in our user entity data. Navigate to the userdata.cpp file. Delete the generated constructor and destructor. Implement the first overloaded constructor. Initialize the member variables. And in the body of the constructor, parse the JSON data and set the four Boolean member variables. This constructor will be invoked when there is user entity data that is returned by the getEntities_by_type request. Next, implement the second overloaded constructor. Initialize the member variables. This constructor will be invoked when the createEntity request is made. Next, implement the copy constructor and initialize the member variables. Implement the default constructor and initialize its member variables. Scroll down and implement the setLevelCompleted method. This method will help us in the next lesson when we update a user entity. The user entity gets updated when the user completes a level in Horde mode. Basically, this method will return true if the user beats the corresponding level for the first time, and false if the user has previously beaten the level. This is important so we know when to update brainCloud with the user entity's changes. Implement the getEntityID method. After that, implement the getEntityType method. Next, implement the getJSONData method. This is another method that we'll be using in the next lesson. In the body of the method, we'll be formatting the JSON data based on the values of the four Boolean member variables. Then we'll return the formatted JSON string. Finally, implement the four Boolean getter methods. Navigate to the constants.h file. Declare a constant for the user progress entity type. Make sure that the string matches the entity type as it appears on the brainCloud portal that we entered in the previous lesson. Navigate to the network callback.h file. At the top, include userdata.h. Then scroll down and declare a quartet of callback methods. The first two are for handling the response for the getEntities_by_type request, and the second two are for handling the response for the createEntity request. Navigate to the networkmanager.h file. Scroll down and declare a pair of public methods. The first method is called requestUserEntityData. The second method is called createUserEntityData. Scroll down and declare a pair of private callback functions that will be used for getting the user entities by type. Then declare another pair of private callback methods. This time they'll be used for the create entity request. Make sure to mark all 4 methods as a U function with a callback category. Finally, declare a pair of private network callback handler objects called mGetUserEntityDataCallback and mCreateUserEntityDataCallback. Navigate to the networkmanager.cpp file. At the top, make sure brainCloud ACL.h is included. In the constructor, bind the private callback methods that are used for getting the user entities by type to the mGetUserEntityDataCallback handler success and failure delegates. Then bind the private callback methods used for creating the user entity to the mCreateUserEntityDataCallback handler success and failure delegates. Scroll down. Implement the requestUserEntityData method. First, we're going to check to see if the user is authenticated. If the user is not authenticated, we'll log a meaningful error message. And then if set, we'll invoke the callbacks on userEntityDataRequest failed method. If the user is authenticated, invoke brainCloud's entity services getEnitiesByType request. Pass in the constant for the user progress entity and the address of the mGetUserEntityData object as the arguments. Next, implement the createUserEntityData method. First, we're going to check to see if the user is authenticated. If the user is not authenticated, we'll log a meaningful error message. And then if set, invoke the callbacks on createUserEntityDataRequest failed method. If the user is authenticated, declare a string with formatted JSON data to represent the initial state of the user entity. Next, declare an ACL variable with a state of none. Then invoke the brainCloud's entity services createEntityRequest. Pass in the formatted JSON data, the ACL, and the address of the mCreateUserEntityData object as the arguments. Scroll down to the bottom. Implement the onGetUserEntityData callback method. In the body, log the response data. Then declare a pointer to a user data object called userData. Create a JSON reader using the JSON response data. Then declare a JSON object and using the JSON reader, deserialize the JSON data. If the JSON data was deserialized successfully, we can now start to parse the data. Get the data JSON object from the root JSON object, then from the data object, get the entities array. Remember, this request will return all the user entities with the requested entity type. In our case, that will only be one entity per user. However, in your game, that may be different. In our example here, we only need to parse a single user entity object. However, in your game, if you have several entities that have the requested entity type, then you will need to loop through and parse through all those entities that are returned. Next, ensure that there's actually an entity to parse. Parse the entity ID, the entity type, and the entity data object. Dynamically allocate a user data object, passing in the entity ID, entity type, and the entity data as the arguments. Remember, the user data's constructor will finish parsing the entity data object. If the callback pointer is set, invoke the callbacks on userEntityDataRequestCompleted method. Pass in the user data pointer as the argument. There is a chance that the user data pointer could be null, and if that's the case, that will be our signal that we need to create the user entity instead since it doesn't exist yet. Finally, since we dynamically allocated an object, we need to clean up that memory. Implement the onGetUserEntityData error method. In the body, log an error message along with the error response, and then if set, invoke the callbacks on userEntityDataRequest failed method. Once that's done, implement the onCreateUserEntityData callback method. In the body, log the response data, create a JSON reader using the JSON response data. Then declare a JSON object and using the JSON reader, deserialize the JSON data. If the JSON data was deserialized successfully, we can now start to parse the data. Get the data JSON object from the root JSON object, then parse the entity ID and the entity type. If the callback pointer is set, invoke the callbacks on createUserEntityDataRequestCompleted method. Pass in the entity ID and the entity type as the arguments. Finally, implement the onCreateUserEntityData error method. In the body, log an error message along with the error response, and then if set, invoke the callbacks on createUserEntityDataRequest failed method. Navigate to the Space Shooter Game Mode base.h file. At the top, include userdata.h. Scroll down. and declare a public method called getUserData. Scroll down again and override the onUserEntityRequestCompleted method. Then override the onCreateUserEntityDataRequestCompleted method. Scroll down to the bottom and declare a private member variable of type userData called mUserData. Navigate to the SpaceShooter GameModeBase.cbp file. In the constructor, initialize the userData object. Scroll down. Implement the getUserData method. In the body, return the address of the mUserData object. Scroll all the way to the bottom. Implement the onUserEntityRequestCompleted method. In the body, if the user data pointer is not null, create a new user data object using the copy constructor and assign the result to the mUserData object. However, if the user data pointer is null, invoke the network manager's createUserEntityData method. Next, implement the onCreateUserEntityDataRequestCompleted method. In the body, create a new user data object, pass in the entity ID and the entity type as the arguments. Scroll up and find the onAuthenticationRequestCompleted method. In the body, invoke the network manager's requestUserEntityData method. Navigate to the levelSelectDialog.h file. Override the onShow method, then navigate to the levelSelectDialog.cbp file. At the top, include userdata.h. Then implement the onShow method. In the body, we're going to set the enabled state for levels 2, 3, and the boss button based on the values of the respective data in the user data object. For example, if the user has been level 1, then the button for level 2 will be enabled. The button for level 3 will only become enabled when the user beats level 2, and so on. Click the Run button to build the project and launch the Unreal editor. Once the Unreal editor opens, run the game. Then, once brainCloud connects, click Stop. Navigate into Xcode. In the output logs, notice that there is a create entity response. Remember, we only invoke the create entity request if the entities array that is returned in the get entities by type request is empty. Scroll up and find the get entities by type response. In the response, notice that the array of entities is empty. Navigate back into the Unreal editor. Run the game, and after brainCloud connects, stop the game and head back into Xcode. Check the output logs. Notice in the output that there isn't a create entity response. That's because the get entities by type response contained an array of entities. This entities array was populated with data from the previous session's create entity request. Updating user entities is the next lesson in the Unreal BootCamp.